Welcome, everybody. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life, and so delighted to welcome all of you in the room and on our live stream to Awakening Our Democracy, Divided We Stand, and there's a question mark that you can see there, Reflections on the U.S. Political Landscape. We have a fantastic panel whom I'll introduce in a moment. First, a quick word about the Awakening Our Democracy series and about the Office of University Life. So at University Life, we provide a hub for university-wide student life information, resources, and opportunities for students as well as faculty and staff to come together, to engage, to have some fun, and also to talk about the pressing issues of our time. And obviously our subject for today is one of those. Now, as you may know, we began these conversations to think about the midterm elections last week with what we call a pop-up event, Let's Talk, featuring student speakers and then students in roundtable conversations to start thinking through some of the issues before us. Today's discussion is part of University Life's Awakening Our Democracy series. This is a series of lunchtime conversation gatherings that focus on race, ethnicity, disparities, justice issues, and other pressing issues facing our campus and society. And that brings us to today, Awakening Our Democracy, Divided We Stand, ? Reflections on the Political Landscape. So if you Google election results and you look at the maps, particularly the maps of the US Senate and House, what you see, as everybody here probably knows, is a map that's about half red and half blue, although in very different locations. And even as several races remain contested, including in Florida and Georgia, that's basically what the map looks like. Now, if you think back to a time before there were magic maps on cable news and before there was the internet, we would also see in a series of elections maps that look red. I mean, not that red and blue was always used, but look in that same way, sort of, are we a country divided? What does this mean? Yet many people today say now feels different. There was an interesting Washington Post report last week where they asked people leaving the polls in so-called battleground states if they could pick one word to describe how they felt. Now, about 42%, so nearly half of voters said they felt hopeful. More than a third, though, said the principal word that came to mind for them was angry. And nearly 2 in 5 voters said they were anxious. So today we will have a chance to talk together about the results, about the reactions, and what this means for our future nationally, internationally, as well as on our own campus here at Columbia. Now, I want to thank many of you who shared your questions for today, and I'll just share out a couple of the questions we received. So quick sample. How can we reach rural voters across the nation when so many of the nation's leading voices in government and academia and journalism are speaking from urban areas? How do we think about voter suppression and about people who say, my vote doesn't matter? When will issues like climate change and the health of sexual and gender minority communities make it onto platforms in a meaningful way? For people not originally from the United States, how would you summarize, this is to you panel to think about, what these elections say about Americans and their values? And what is the role of independents and moderates in today's polarized climate? And of course, very important for us here, what is the role of students and faculty and staff at academic institutions? So with that, I want to introduce today's panel, and I'll start at the far end with Reena Shah. Reena is a political strategist and former advisor on Vote, Run, Lead, an organization that trains women to run for political office and win. I think that was underscored in your website. She also has served as a senior aide to 2 Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives and is now a partner in Red Fort Strategies, a bipartisan government relations and public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. Next to Reena is Professor Nicholas Lemon. He's the director of Columbia World Projects and the Dean Emeritus of Columbia Journalism School, where we are today. He is a prolific author as a staff writer for The New Yorker, author of 5 books, additional reporting on national affairs just about everywhere you can read, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. And if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to read his recent profile on Claire McCaskill and the Senate race that she faced and recently lost by 6 points in Missouri. against her Republican challenger. Next to Professor Lemon is Professor Michelle Adams. She joins us from Cardozo Law School, where she co-directs the Florsheim Center for Constitutional Democracy. Professor Adams' scholarship concentrates on affirmative action, race, sex discrimination, and housing law, and she is the author of a forthcoming book, publication house just announced at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, on the end of school desegregation. Professor Adams has also been a commentator for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and earlier in her career was a lawyer with the Legal Aid Society. Next to Professor Adams is Laura Williamson. She works as a policy analyst with Demos, a public policy organization working to reduce political and economic inequality through research, advocacy, litigation, and strategic communications. Her work focuses on voting rights, money and politics, civic participation, and related issues. And her prior experience includes leadership of Young People For, an organization dedicated to developing the next generation of progressive leaders. And our moderator for today, to my immediate left, is Shayla Murray. Shayla joined Columbia this year in September as our Executive Vice President for Public Affairs. She was most recently, before joining us at Columbia, Senior Advisor to President Obama, and prior to that served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director for Vice President Joe Biden. Shayla has extensive experience as a journalist for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, for which she covered Capitol Hill and knows, I think, every election and she's covered a lot of elections. I'll just leave it there. We're thrilled to have this panel help us sort through these issues for today. Here's the format. Shayla will moderate a conversation among the panelists for some time, and then she will open up to questions from the audience, and we will take questions in groups of 3 from students. So we'll have people come around with mics, and all we ask is that you say your first name, your last if you want, what school you're from, and that you ask a brief question, and so that it's brief enough to give our panelists time to comment. So thanks very much for being here. So delighted to have you. And Shayla, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you. So I loved covering midterms as a reporter. Without the long shadow of a presidential election, it's a really insightful way to look at the country and where it's headed. Helps you see the regional distinctions in the country and also generational distinctions in a way that presidential elections don't generally reveal. So there's a lot to be learned about the country right now, I think, and we want to start this off with some questions for our panelists on some of the big themes from this election, not just the individual race outcomes, but some of the takeaways of what's happening in our country. So I'll start with Rena. Rena is a Republican consultant who previously worked for Congressman Scott Garrett of New Jersey, who lost his suburban Republican seat in the previous cycle. So Rena, I thought maybe you could help enlighten us to what has happened in the suburbs where Republican House members were swamped, also in state legislative races. Give us a sense of what's going on in these communities with these voters.
Well, in the communities, certainly something has changed, and I think it's a great distaste for the current occupant of the Oval Office. We see that white, suburban, college-educated women were the nightmare. It came true. We have the empirical evidence now. There was a conclave put together by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina just, I believe, yesterday, and I'm surprised. I was not invited. I really am. I'll tell you why, because I've been on the forefront of working on Republican women's issues for quite some time now, ever since I left Capitol Hill, which was 8 years ago. And so when we don't have a seat at the table, the Republican women who've been on the front lines, we know that our message is being lost. We warned of this for a long time. There's massive electoral losses. We see that the number of Republican women in the U.S. House of Representatives is now down to 14. That was down from 23. That's staggering. We were already low. There are more Democratic female senators in the U.S. Senate than there are Republican women in the House of Representatives. That's shameful. And so this conclave, I assume, was brought together out of concern for these suburban voters. But it's very simple. White, college-educated women in the suburbs love pro-business policies. They love the economic message of the Republican Party. they're not so sure about the rhetoric they're hearing from President Donald Trump. And we see it now. Midterms are very interesting
What are
in that
they
way.
hearing that alarms them? What are these messages? Are these the caravan, the xenophobia, the racism, the us versus them, the divisive rhetoric? Is that what's turning them off?
Well, the misogyny, I hear from a lot of Republican women in that we always knew that President Trump had a problem with women. You know, he's on his third marriage. It's really evident that this is not a person that was a lifelong evangelical Christian. But what was so confusing and remains to me so is that evangelical Christians, they really gave the president this presidency. And so for them, I think we've got to go deeper. The white working man in flyover country, the states like Missouri, I think of, where Josh Hawley beat Claire McCaskill, they're worried. They're either underemployed or not employed. Work has changed for them. And the Republican Party gives them a message that these others are coming, either to blow up your buildings from Saudi Arabia or to take your jobs from Mexico. And it's a very scary message. And while the economy seems to be going well, what drives people to the polls? National security. And I think that's why Republicans were able to come as close as they did in the suburbs.
Right.
But those women, the women really hate the misogyny. They don't know how to explain to their very young children how to level up what they're hearing in school and from home versus what the president is saying.
Thank you. Michelle,
Yes.
after the riots in Charlottesville, you wrote an essay about where you reflected on it, and you wrote, "The question now is whether we are entering a prolonged period of racial retrenchment, much as we did after 1877, or whether this is just a speed bump on the road to a more multiracial and egalitarian society." Reflecting on some of the developments last week, we saw some interesting movement in the South. Progressive African American candidates came very close to winning the governorships of two very important states, Florida and Georgia. Democrats also flipped a House seat in South Carolina and a couple of very Republican districts in Virginia, old Virginia, not Northern Virginia. Do those results help clarify this question for you or get you closer to an answer?
I want to say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There's part of me that I feel like in order to understand what happened last week, you have to hold two potentially conflicting ideas in your head simultaneously. The first idea is that this country is racist. The second idea is that there have never been more anti-racist white people in this country at this time. And those two things, I think, are happening simultaneously. There's a part of me that's incredibly optimistic, given what we saw happen last week and what's still unfolding. We were saying beforehand, before we got on stage, that I was really happy we didn't have this, say, last Wednesday or last Thursday. Because I think the election looks really different today than it looked last week. You mentioned what Florida and Georgia, we don't know what the outcome's going to be in Florida and Georgia, right? We could be looking at a runoff or a recount in Georgia. We're looking at recounts in Florida. My guess is that it's unlikely that it's going to change the result, but you don't know, right?
Just as a reminder too, in Florida and Georgia, those Democratic candidates, both progressive African Americans, beat much more traditional white Democratic primary opponents who were viewed as the weaker primary candidates, but could win statewide because they were more moderate white Democrats.
Yeah.
And yet both Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams came as close to the water's edge as you could possibly get to winning those races. And certainly Stacey Abrams has outperformed many, any Democratic candidate for governor in recent memory in Georgia.
Let's take a step back and talk about why I'm optimistic. And then I can sort of, add a couple of reasons why I'm cautious. I'm optimistic because if you go back to 2016, there was a book that came out by Steve Phillips. I don't know if you all saw it. It was called Brown is the New White. And I think he had an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of days ago. And the thesis of the book was basically that the Democratic Party was poised to be able to win across the country. But in order to be able to do that, they had to change the way they were doing business. And what he meant by that was to say that the Democratic Party had to begin to put money in different places than it had put it in the past. He went and looked at a bunch of data from the Democratic National Committee and from the DCCC, which sort of runs elections for re-elections for Democratic candidates. He looked at how they were spending money, and basically he said, we're spending money on all these ad buys, we're spending money on big firms, but we're not spending a lot of money on getting out the vote. We're not spending a lot of money on the ground with organizations that actually know people in neighborhoods and can help them get out to vote. And so what he suggested is that if we did that, if the Democrats did that, and combine that with running a really exciting candidate, like say someone like Barack Obama, that in fact you could put together a coalition that would include people of color, progressive whites, gay men, lesbians, LGBTQ community, and that you could win in many, many, many jurisdictions. And I think the reason why I'm optimistic is that you see some evidence of that working both in Florida and in Georgia, right? Again, we don't know what the outcome is going to be in those elections, but if you're correct that if you look at the fact that there was extraordinarily high turnout in those races, and the fact that someone like Stacey Abrams did better than moderate whites have done running a statewide election, it gives me a sense of optimism to be able to think that even in the Deep South, you can put together a coalition that can win. Maybe not this time, but next time. And so for those reasons, I continue to be optimistic, because I think that instead of thinking about Democrats sort of running the resistance, actually we should reconfigure that and talk about the fact that we're the majority, right? When you add up sort of all the different groups, progressive whites, you actually can put together a majority coalition. The caveat to that, I think, though, is when you look at some of the structural constraints that make it difficult for that emerging Democratic majority to lead, those structural constraints are there. And we can talk about those maybe a little bit more, about sort of how our elections are structured. The other caveat I would add would be that white folks are still incredibly susceptible to racist appeals, right? 73% of white women in Georgia voted for Kemp, that was Stacey Abrams' opponent. And the fact that the president was able to use racist appeals effectively, I think had a tremendous sort of impact in these races. So those are the caveats that I would give.
Thank you. Nick, so you spent some time with Claire McCaskill in Missouri. Claire McCaskill is a feisty, independent Democrat, long battle-tested holdout in the Midwest. And she talks very eloquently in your piece and just generally about confronting the Fox News effect in huge many corners of her state, where really the only media people are consuming is either Fox News or conservative-owned radio and TV stations. So a number of you asked questions related to this sort of rural-urban divide and what's going on in Middle America, and how come the coast and Middle America seem so disconnected. I think Claire McCaskill, the story of Claire McCaskill, helps illuminate that story a little bit. Can you tell us what you learned traveling around Missouri with her and talking to her?
Well, first of all, the problem with the conservative media effect as an explanatory factor is, I'm told, although I don't know if anybody knows this from personal experience, you can actually watch Fox News in zip code 10027. Yet somehow people here are able to resist its powers, So, and people in rural Missouri can watch MSNBC. So in a way, it sort of begs the question of why do some places in the country seem, very susceptible to the siren song of right-wing talk radio and TV, and other places seem immune. So there's a kind of underlying thing going on. Which is complicated and hard to pinpoint. I think this is an election that was showing up as tide, toss-up in the polls. The last poll to come out, which was an NBC poll, showed McCaskill ahead by 2, and then Hawley won by 6. So it was kind of an outlier election in the modified blue wave trend. And I would say, the deciding factor, if I had to guess, well, 2 things I want to highlight. One, Trump himself. There are a lot of parts of Missouri where Trump is incredibly popular, and he came to Missouri 5 times during the fall campaign, including twice. My mic is off. Okay. Yeah. Where is the switch? Oh. Did I turn?
It's on the top,
Oh, okay.
right here.
Okay. Now is it on? Perfect. All right, okay. I won't take it from the top, but Trump went 5 times. The very last moments of campaigning were in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, with Rush Limbaugh on one side and Sean Hannity on the other. Josh Hawley, the winning candidate, was sort of brought on stage for a moment and patted on the head. And Hawley himself, formerly a serious conservative intellectual and law professor, ran as Trump's, third son or something, and used Trumpian rhetoric that he had never used before in his career. So Trump is hitting a chord in Missouri, mainly rural Missouri. Missouri, one of the interesting sort of killer stats about Trumpism is Trump carried, I think the figure is 85% of the counties in America, which is way ahead of traditional Republican strength and speaks to the ruralization of the Republican Party. There's 114 counties in Missouri. Hawley carried 110 of the 114. I think McCaskill, I don't know if anybody here has ever seen Citizen Kane, the great movie where there's this Rosebud, the one thing that explains everything about Citizen Kane's behavior. So Rosebud for Claire McCaskill is, up to last week, she had run for office 23 times and won 22 times. So of course, in her mind, what she focused on was the one she had lost, which was the Missouri governor's race in 2004, where she felt she lost because she didn't campaign enough in rural Missouri. So this cycle, in retrospect and hindsight, almost to a bizarre extent, she just stayed in rural Missouri relentlessly. And she didn't try to do what you guys have been talking about. She didn't try to motivate that much the suburban college-educated women. She didn't spend that much time in minority communities. And she was just out there in rural Missouri over and over and over again saying, I'm a moderate, I'm a moderate, I'm a moderate. There's an emotional logic to it for her. That's where she grew up. There's a logic mathematically, which is if you lose by a little, it makes a difference. But, she tried that hypothesis and it didn't work for her.
I also think she may have overinterpreted that she needed to work harder to penetrate. And do you think she voted against Brett Kavanaugh? She was one of the moderate Democrats.
Yeah, so all 3, there were 3 flipped Democratic seats that are sort of tied to the Kavanaugh vote, and that's Heitkamp in North Dakota, Donnelly in Indiana, and McCaskill in Missouri. Manchin in West Virginia voted for Kavanaugh and won big. So I do think that mattered. And she's smart, and she knew it was a problematic vote. She voted against Gorsuch also. So she did it. I mean, I should say, first of all, she almost never talked about Trump on the campaign trail. It was like, there's this big thing that's out there, but we're not going to talk about it. The last of 3 debates, she sort of slipped up and mentioned his name once, but So the day of the incredibly riveting Kavanaugh testimony by Christine Blasey Ford, or the day after, and Kavanaugh, on her Twitter feed, there was this picture of her holding a little puppy, and with the headline, "This is what's really important." So she was terrified of that vote, and she did the brave thing and voted no. But interestingly, she voted no a week before the testimony.
Right.
And she made a big point of saying, I'm not voting no because of Christine Blasey Ford. I'm voting no for this completely other reason, which is that Kavanaugh doesn't believe in campaign spending limits. And then that week, she was nowhere to be found. So, what are you going to do? I would say it's really easy to sit here and say she should have come out and said, I'm running against Brett Kavanaugh, I don't think that would have flipped things for her necessarily.
Yeah, she's one more point on her. She won in a Democratic wave in 2006, and
Right.
Was one of the first people to endorse Barack Obama for president. And she kind of lost her way on that independent
Yeah.
streak, and I think might have caught up.
I mean,
with her too
it
eventually.
raises, this gets back to your question, which I can't fully answer, which is Obama lost Missouri in 2008 by half a
Barely,
point.
yeah.
It was the closest state that he didn't win. 2012, he lost by 10. Hillary Clinton lost by 20. Why is that? What happened?
See you later, Missouri.
Is Missouri lost forever? If so, why is it lost forever?
I would
Right,
submit
right.
to you that it was Kavanaugh. It was. I've been in the trenches with Republican women for years now, but mainly in this past year trying to understand, especially after Trump. And I was even with a moderate Republican woman from California yesterday who said to me, wasn't he treated so poorly? And I almost left my jaw on the floor because I was one that felt that he didn't deserve to be a justice after after he showed us what his temperament was. And I believe Dr. Ford, but I met a whole slew of Republican women
Yeah.
who were part of the Never Trump movement, like me, who actually sided with Kavanaugh. And I was very much shocked by that. They were moderates who sided with Kavanaugh. I think it had a great deal to do with her loss.
Yeah. Well, we should invite her to campus. Laura. She's got some time on her hands. So you've worked on a host of progressive causes around the country, including in Louisiana, where one of the little noticed but important results on Tuesday was that Louisiana moved to adopt unanimous jury verdicts, repealing a Jim Crow era law that allowed 10 of 12 jurors to send people to prison for felonies. Is a significant step forward in criminal justice reform. I think only one state in the country, Oregon, still allows these split jury verdicts. Meanwhile, Florida voted to restore voting rights to 1.4 million felons, which the ACLU has described as the largest expansion of voting rights since the voting age was reduced to 18 almost 50 years ago. But on the other hand, we're seeing some disturbing patterns of voter suppression across the South, but really all over the country. And it kind of raises the question of how can, on the one hand, are we becoming more decent as a society, and with states and cities taking meaningful steps to restore rights to criminals. I mean, Colorado last week banned free labor by prison inmates. But yet we're still weak on this very fundamental right, the right that all of us have to vote. And by the way, Democrats are not excused by this. One of the worst offenders in the country is New York State, which doesn't allow early voting, which is a classic form of voter suppression. So tell us, help us make sense of these patterns and what's going on.
I'll do my best. I don't know if I can fully make sense of it, but I appreciate you lifting up those examples because I think it's really easy to get stuck in what happened in the House and in Congress. But if we can look beyond that and even beyond some of these high-profile gubernatorial races that we're still watching, what I saw on Tuesday is that people across the country from many different identities and from various political persuasions came together in support of criminal justice reform, in support of economic justice, in support of democracy. And so if we look at the ballot initiatives and referenda that passed in states blue, purple, and many actually red states, we see that there is really in some places a strong majority of people who want to vote for policies that work for working class and middle class people, that ensure that the ballot box is accessible to people regardless of race and class, that begins to chip away at the sort of seemingly monumental injustice of our criminal justice system like we saw in Louisiana. And I think it's worth noting, particularly on the Florida example, on Amendment 4, we're watching Florida closely for many reasons right now, and whatever happens with the outstanding elections, they'll clearly be decided on a razor-thin margin. But what happened on Amendment 4, which was this rights restoration initiative for formerly incarcerated people, is that more than 60% of Floridians voted to pass that, as they had to actually by state law. You have to have a 60 plus majority. So clearly, that coalition of people crossed lines of race and of class and of political persuasion. We also saw in places like Missouri and Arkansas that strong majorities voted in favor of raising the minimum wage. In Michigan, in Nevada, people passed automatic voter registration, which is also a very powerful tool for bringing more people into the political process. Marylanders showed strong support for same-day registration. Voters in 3 states rejected gerrymandering in favor of independent redistricting processes. Voters in 6 states either voted for Medicaid expansion or elected governors who have promised to expand Medicaid. And so these are not in many cases slim majorities.
Including
These
Idaho.
are strong. Yeah, these are red states: Nebraska, Idaho, Utah, many others, and they're majorities that again necessarily cross many of these lines, perceived lines of division that certain politicians would like us to believe that we are separated by. And so I actually find great hope coming out of Tuesday's election. I think it's also worth double clicking on or underscoring your point, Michelle, that at the same time, we saw clearly on Tuesday, as we saw in 2016, that people are also still driven by fear, and that we, especially white people and white voters, are highly susceptible still to race baiting and to dog whistle politics. And in places where these tactics were employed, as they were aggressively employed in Georgia and in Florida, people can actually, be more motivated by those politics of fear than by our own economic self-interest and our, commitment to criminal justice reform or true democracy. And so, I take hope, and I also, think we should have our eyes open and be smart about the fact that this potential that we saw in these majorities and these multiracial cross-class coalitions doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to, convert that into real electoral power in 2020 and beyond. Especially again, as certain politicians double down on their divisive rhetoric and their dog whistles. But there's real potential there. And I think we should all sort of have our eyes open about that and be smart about that and figure out how to take the lessons we learned outside of Congress on Tuesday ahead.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to a series of questions that you all provided in advance, helpfully. Thank you. So one is, when will climate change get onto platforms in a meaningful, aggressive, action-oriented way? I would point out that climate change was actually quite a big issue in a number of these House races in Florida and California, sort of front lines of climate change these days. But maybe, Rena, you could help us understand, especially with younger voters and women voters. I mean, the messaging around climate change, I think we can all agree, has been quite a failure over the years. How do we reinvigorate this conversation and make progress? I mean, I will say Chicago did ban drinking straws, I believe, so.
Well, that is not enough.
Yeah, that is not enough. There's a lot of energy out there.
I'm a pro-conservation Republican. One of my idols is Teddy Roosevelt. And since I'm in a room with a bunch of college students, I got to tell you, there's a co-ed out there. He's at the University of Washington. His name is Benji Backer, and he started the American Conservation Coalition. Look it up. I believe the handle is ACC_national, something like that. Anyways, look it up. It's a group of pro-conservation conservatives like myself talking about common sense when it comes to really climate change and other issues that impact our environment. And I think you'll be surprised. There have been a number of members of Congress who are Republican who've been supportive of the efforts of this outside group. And when the party's not listening, what do? You do something outside the party structure, which is what I did with women and continue to do. And I've been supportive of ACC's work. So please do look them up because you'll get educated, and not all Republicans hate the environment. I will say, though, we lost Carlos Curbelo, the congressman from Florida, on Tuesday, and that's a staggering loss because he was just one of the very few. There's Congressman Mike Kaufman. We also lost Congresswoman Mia Love. That was tough for me as well. I lost my moderates on Tuesday night. I'm still sort of reeling. This is therapy for me.
Right.
So yeah, the people who were considered moderates in Congress, moderate Republicans that really care about the environment and introduced bills to really move the needle in terms of Republicans accepting science and accepting some of these greater and better bipartisan solutions that have been put out there. It's going to be tougher. This is a more Trumpian GOP conference now. I mean, he successfully remade the party in his image, and So I say for him, mission was accomplished, unfortunately, on Tuesday night. But we will continue with outside pressure, and we'll do it ahead of the RNC convention coming up in 2020. Push them to put in language in the in the party's platform. Each state goes and takes their own party platform and sits there. I did run to be on the party platform committee in the last convention, but with a few keystrokes of my name, you can find out I was unseated unjustly from my delegate position to the Republican National Convention. I won't waste any time talking about that here, though. But the point is, unless you have some newer voices at the table crafting these party platforms, and then people like Congressman Curbelo and Congresswoman Mia Love, part of the groups that are putting pressure on the conference to change language, it's just not going to change.
Right. So here's a popular one. Do you think that Beto O'Rourke's narrow loss can be characterized as a success for the Democratic Party? Was his nationally fomented celebrity a downfall in his campaign? And to just cut to the chase, Michelle, should Beto O'Rourke run for president?
In 2020?
Yeah, well,
I think he should take Cornyn on. He should run for Senate in 2020. There's another Senate seat that he could run in. He could run for. I think he electrified the state of Texas. Unbelievable, three percentage points he lost by. But the key thing, again, in thinking about what he did is the effect he had on down ballot races, right? So when you look at sort of the numbers of people who came out, that actually I have a stat. I've got a stat on this. Let me pull it out of my pocket. Let me see if I can find it. I can't find it, but I'll memorize it. I think voter turnout was up 63% in Texas. And so I think what it shows again is this idea of running an incredibly exciting candidate who can connect. So I mean, I think everybody and their mother is going to run for president in 2020. I think running for Senate would probably make more sense.
What do you think, Nick, about Beto?
Basically the same. You may not know this, but I think I'm the only person up here on the panel who's an admiral in the Texas Navy, so I can really speak with authority here.
Get back.
And that's an honorific given to people who lived in Texas a long time, as I did. So, it's classic, like if you did a generic ballot of a Senate race, you would expect a blowout for the Republican based on past data. So clearly Beto O'Rourke did way, way better than you'd expect, and you have to consider it a big win for him, even though he didn't win the election, because he beat expectations so much. When I moved to Texas back 40 years ago, it still had Democratic statewide officials.
Yeah.
But at the time I was living there, that just got wiped out, and it's a big deal for how well he did, really big deal. And it sort of speaks to the whole, I mean, we forget George W. Bush and Karl Rove were really scared about what would happen if an ever more Latino Texas kept the seal tight between Latino voters and the Democratic Party. You forget, when Bush was inaugurated as governor of Texas, he arranged to have the governors of all the neighboring states in Mexico sitting behind him on the dais at his inauguration to sort of start his appeal to Latino voters, which never quite worked, but a long way from Trumpism.
Yes, times have changed. So what, I like this question. What does winning the House really mean? Where do we go from here? I guess another way of asking this is, should Democrats move to impeach Trump, or should they move to solve some of our big problems? What do you think about that, Laura?
I'm going to say a hard move to fix some of our big problems, not actually at the exclusion of whatever they decide that they need to do with their investigative powers. But I think, clearly we have divided government in Washington, and Democrats are not going to be successful in passing and making into law any major progressive reforms right now. But they now have a huge platform to test out a number of ideas that have been just sort of swimming in the, think tanky / sort of sad, back rooms of the minority halls of Congress for a while, and to test them out and sort of see if they have legs, and to refine them and to figure out what precisely is it that will appeal to, again, this broad majority, this cross-racial, multi-class majority of people on issues that we actually care about, that really, really are affecting us. And so, a lot of people will say, whatever, waste of time. Don't go passing all these laws that are not going to go anywhere. But I actually disagree. I think that there's a lot that Democrats can do with the House majority, again, to set pieces into place and to figure some stuff out before we, ideally have the opportunity to move on them in a serious way after 2020.
Let's just remind the audience in terms of the constitutional requirements of impeachment, just so we're all on the same page with respect to that. So the House impeaches, which means that's the indictment, basically saying this is what the particular official did wrong. If the House decides, a majority of the House decides that it wants to return these articles of impeachment, which is like an indictment in a criminal case, then it goes over to the Senate, and then there's a trial in the Senate. But the thing about the Senate is that the Senate, in order to be able to remove the official, has to do so using a supermajority. You can't just do it by a simple majority like 50+1. And so the reality is for the Democrats that even if they were to impeach the president, and I can imagine there might be a wide variety of articles of impeachment that they could return, the president is not going to be removed by the Senate. So the Democrats have got to think very strategically about what their role is in the constitutional design, about actually investigating the president, which I think they have to do. I think constitutionally that's the role of the House. But I think they also have to understand that they're not going to actually be able to result in removing the president, and they have to think about what they want politically. I mean, my view is that they can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So they can go ahead and they can engage in this constitutionally required process of doing the kind of investigation that needs to get done, at the same time doing some of the things that Laura talked about in terms of doing test trial runs with respect to the kinds of progressive legislation that I think we'd like to see get passed.
Right. And big difference between impeachment proceedings and just the regular oversight that we
I
haven't
think
seen
they
in a
can't let
couple years.
impeachment become the dominating message.
Right.
But I think they've got to engage in oversight. They have to engage in oversight.
My
once
fear is that they're going to make it rain with subpoenas come January, and it's just going to be a mess because that's all it's going to be known for, these chairmanships, is subpoenaing everybody left and right from the Trump organization. And voters are going to be sick of it. They're going to need the aspirational messages that Democrats tried to win with this past election. And they're going to need to see actual legislation and policies. And I'm just afraid of it being screwed up by the Democrats. I mean, look, the party in power always gets a little overconfident. We got rid of Eric Cantor that same way. And now look what happened to former Congressman Eric Cantor. See, he was super confident. He was in leadership of the House. And then this guy named David Brat took it from him. And now it just went back to Democrats. So, there's a lot of confidence that comes with leadership and having power. And I just feel like Democrats are going to screw it up if they don't have a new speaker that's name is not Nancy Pelosi. It's just where I
Can
think
I
it
just
should
interject
be.
here?
Yeah,
One second.
yeah, please.
I'll let you take Pelosi. I think you wanted to take Pelosi. I'm going to take Pelosi. But I will say the initial signals have been positive from my perspective, which is to say it looks like they're going to introduce some sort of pro-democracy package. I think the Democratic Party needs to be the party of democracy. The Republican Party is not the party of democracy right now. And I think if the Democrats can move forward with some of the kinds of democratic reforms that I think we desperately need, that could be very, very positive. And it's underscored by some of the elections that you mentioned that happened in the states.
Yeah. No, I actually was going to sort of echo that. There's legislation that's already written and that is being improved right now that would restore the Voting Rights Act, that would deal with campaign finance issues, that would add new, much more expansive protections for voters and improve access to the franchise and address some of these voter suppression tactics that we've seen that would love to have time to talk more about. And their plan is for it to be the first piece of legislation that they introduce pretty immediately.
And young Republicans, I don't have the numbers with me right now, but there's some good research out there showing that amongst young Republicans, attitudes are changing on the influence of money in elections.
Right, that's
so on
great.
Citizens United and on gerrymandering. So to me, that signals good positive change, and that's why I don't leave the party, because I'm really hopeful in the Republican women and the young Republicans, the 18 to 29 set that I've come across.
Do you think there's an opportunity for bipartisanship on some of those issues that you just mentioned?
Absolutely, because now that we'll have a divided government, a House that's controlled by Democrats, I'm far more hopeful that nice, give and take that we should have in Congress. From being a former Hill staffer, I know that nothing gets done on Capitol Hill unless both sides come to the middle. And so they're going to force the hand of far-right Republicans to come. So I am hopeful that there will be more bipartisanship now that the House is no longer under control of Republicans.
Well, from your lips to God's ears.
Let's
We will now begin Q&A. So we're going to take 3 questions at a time, and then we will throw our panel into the the pyre.
Hi, so thanks so much for coming. My name's Andre Liu. I'm a student at SIPA. And I actually had a question specifically for Rena. I'm curious to know why you remain in the Republican Party when so much of what you say aligns with democratic values. And although I understand that, like you, many Republicans are hopeful that there can be change in the Republican Party, why do you still remain when you have seen the way that it's transformed into something else, and when you see that the Democratic Party so much aligns more with what you believe in?
Well, the core of my beliefs.
We're
sorry, we're gonna do two more?
Yeah, sorry.
I'll hold tight.
Yeah, yes.
Hi, my name is Jose. I'm from the journalism school. And my question is, the midterms kind of showed that Republicans are leaning more towards a Trumpian route. How do you see that going into 2020? And how do you see that after Trump is gone, if he does win 2020?
Hi, my name is David. I'm from the Columbia School of Social Work. My question is, because of which the recent election, how will that resonate with the issue of fixing gun control in our society?
Great. Rena, you want to take the first one?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep it short. You know, the core of my beliefs is that I just don't want the government in my backyard, my bank account, or my bedroom. Now I realize the party's changed, and does a lot of that. You know, regulation is hard. You know, and I think for me, I know what a big government can do. I like limited government because I think when citizens come together and we speak up, public-private partnerships happen, and that's a good thing. But I don't want everything to be controlled by my government, is what I'm saying. I want that balance. And so at the core of Republican philosophies and ideology, I find myself aligning most. I don't want to hate the other side. I never have. I grew up in a purple state. We voted blue statewide and then red presidential, pretty much, West Virginia. Now it's full red. And so it's tough. It's tough to come to grips with a party that doesn't look like me anymore. It's not very young. It doesn't have people of color like me, a child of immigrants as well. But I remain hopeful that the core beliefs will come back, that we will talk about freedom and liberty in a way that will be for all Americans. I want pro-growth policies. I want policies that help small businesses. You know, like I said, changing attitudes. I'm part of that set. I'm pro-conservation. Teddy Roosevelt was one. There have been people throughout time that have been Republicans but would not recognize what Republicans today are doing. And so I believe that when everything topples, the entire house of cards, I believe, will topple. It's a matter of when. And whether Special Counsel Mueller has anything to do with that. I want to be there to help rebuild the party in an image that I know it's capable of portraying. But right now, people are scared. National security is really big for Republicans. And when you talk about the politics of fear, that drives them to do things that are largely racist and xenophobic. And we have to have honest conversations about that. So I want to be at the forefront of that. And that's why I stay at the party.
Thank you. Nick, you want to address this Trump question?
The Trump question is tough. You know, if you know nothing else about a presidential reelection, you don't know who the people are, the odds are that the president will be reelected. Second big fact would be, how's the economy doing? So if you have an incumbent and the economy's doing pretty well, there's a very high chance the incumbent will be reelected. Again, not knowing who the incumbent is. So then you get to, you know, the specifics. There's a third of the country or so of the voters seem to just love Trump, and the more stuff he does that everybody in this room would consider completely unacceptable, the more they love him. But that's only a third of the country. So if you will, the sort of natural playbook of politics would favor him. But his support is limited, and there's also a very large number of people, unusual for a president, usually large, who really, really don't like him. And the Democrats have a big field of people who are going to possibly cut each other to ribbons during the primary season. So I put a big, you know, question mark on it. I think it's Democrats who are running this is quoting McCaskill, you know, but I think it's true. It's worth thinking both how can we do the scenario Michelle talked about, taking what seems to be the Democratic base and making sure they all go to the polls and really get mobilized, and how can we take people at the edge of Trumpism and pull them over to the Democratic side. But I would not go to bed at night if you're in this room thinking Trump's couldn't possibly win re-election. You know, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, as they used to say in your party.
Indeed.
Laura, do you want to take on the gun control?
Yeah, I can try. I think this is a particularly intransigent issue. I frankly don't have a ton of hope that that it's an issue that we can find a good deal of consensus on, because it's an issue that is so. The NRA is perhaps the most powerful lobby in the United States, and until we reform our campaign finance laws, an entire party is beholden to that lobby, who is, you know, never ever going to let them pass gun control. So I've tried to be hopeful up here. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I don't see, at least federally, I don't see a lot of space for true comprehensive gun control legislation until there's a Democratic majority and president. That said, you know, I think there's a lot that we can do on gun control, and frankly on many issues at the state and local level. Obviously, if federal legislation, you know, civil rights legislation or otherwise, is ideal on a lot of these issues. But especially when we have divided government, we have to look to, you know, our city council chambers and to our state legislatures. That's where a lot of policy happens anyway and should happen. And so I think there's room for movement on that, especially with the changeover in some of the state legislatures and governorships. There's room for it at the state level. As I think that there's room for movement on climate issues, which we're not seeing movement on from the federal government, but we have seen leadership from cities and states on where there's room for policies that can support our immigrant neighbors, since we're only getting terror from the federal government on that, among a whole host of other issues. So I think it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of whether there's room for progress on that.
I would just add that as someone who worked for a Democratic president who tried and failed to enact gun control, very basic gun control measures that were popular with about 90% of the population. This is an interesting issue that points to some of these structural democratic issues that I think are going to define the debate going forward. One of them being, what about the Senate that wildly overrepresents rural states and smaller population states by giving them the same representation as larger states? We have you know, you maybe saw this debate emerge in the New York Times this weekend, where they endorsed this larger House of Representatives. Those are, you know, some very thoughtful people I know in politics talk about this like new constitutional convention idea, where we are, as our population shifts literally to different parts of the country, you know, an issue like gun control, which people are truly unified around, is become impossible to legislate around. And I think that's not a question of will and people taking the right positions as much as it is a system that will not allow those solutions to emerge literally. So that's just a...
And then one more very brief thing on it, which is I was, for one, was incredibly inspired by the organizing of the students of Marjorie Douglas Stoneman High School, among many other young people. I mean, as many people who I think have come up in the age of mass shootings at schools, you can probably appreciate it too. And so everything I said, and like definitely nothing will happen if we're not out in the streets, like organizing, like our lives depend on it, as those students were. And so I hope that you all will get behind whatever cause it is that you believe in and organize.
I have one piece of good news, though, from Georgia. Lucy McBath was just elected. She's from Moms Demand Action, former flight attendant, breast cancer survivor. I was sitting on a stage with her inauguration day, 2017, and didn't know she was going to run against Karen Handel, who had a lot of money behind her, and she was in one of those really interesting districts in Georgia. And to see that she got elected, and because of her work with Moms Demand Action, I fully believe that was a big reason it's good.
It's
good
good,
she's in
it's a good
Congress.
sign. Okay, so let's do one quick round of questions if we have some more questions. Over here. Oh, yeah, right. Oh, yes, you. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Ruby. I'm an undergraduate student in the School of Engineering. My question is, with so many things going on in the country and in the world, can we cover the midterm elections too much? Is too much news covered given to them? Thank you.
Over here. Oh.
Hi, I'm Sunny from School of Social Work. As we walk through in the hall, we were asked to write down what we think justice means to us. I'm just interested to pose that question back to the panel. And so, what does justice mean to you at this stage, and how does that manifest in your work? Thank you.
Hi, my name's David. I'm in the post-bac program, School of General Studies. I feel incredibly passionately about a lot of things, but I think what some of you have touched on is kind of before any of those are even relevant, we have to address gerrymandering and campaign finance. I think there are some other things that are sort of obstacles, like some economic things like automation and job exportation, which logically shouldn't be political, but they end up being so. But just to gerrymandering and campaign finance, what can the people in power do, and what can everyone else do about those two things?
Okay, great. Nick, why don't you take on the Mr. Journalism Professor? Is there too much coverage of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to get out of this box. Those of you in the room who are journalism students will know this very well, but those of you who are not journalism students may not, that the total headcount of employed journalists in the US is down very, very dramatically for economic reasons. About roughly half as many working journalists, employed journalists, as there were 15 years ago. And you see some of these electoral trends that we've talked about, the hollowing out of the middle of the country, moving to the coasts, moving to big national institutions. And so you have fewer reporters, fewer regional reporters, more national reporters, fewer news outlets, and they sort of clump around whatever is the big story of the moment. Just to show you that I personally care about this, one of the things I'm doing now is running a small publishing company here at Columbia called Columbia Global Reports, and we do 6 short books a year on important issues that aren't the things everybody else is covering. So there's a few of us out there trying to go the other way, but I think it's very hard to sort of ask, quote unquote, the press to sort of get their act together and cover these other things, because they're so commercially driven and ratings driven, and there's fewer of us, and we, when I was a kid, were a regulated industry, at least in broadcast, and now we're not, so we're very market driven and ratings driven. That's why the fond hope of everybody in this room that CNN could cut away from Donald Trump once in a while just isn't going to happen, because the more Donald Trump's on the air, the more money you make.
And yet so few local news organizations covering these races in their own backyards.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's skip to the gerrymandering campaign finance question so we can end with a justice question. Why do you ladies want to take that on?
I can start, sure. I appreciate the question. I'm from North Carolina, which is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. We are a third independent, a third Democrat, a third Republican. We vote generally 50-50, red, blue, and yet we have 13 congressional seats, 10 are Republican, and 3 are Democrat, and it's a mess at the state level too, and the gerrymanders have actually been ruled unconstitutional at the state level. So near and dear. And I think there's a lot we can do, actually. I mean, election law is governed by the states for the most part, and so I think that in states that have initiatives, citizens have run ballot initiatives for independent redistricting commissions. So these are bodies of people who, backing up. In the vast majority of states, legislative districts for the state legislature and for Congress are drawn by legislators themselves, since they have every incentive to draw lines that are beneficial for them and their party, and to draw themselves into safe power, essentially. And that is, lo and behold, what state legislators have done for a long time, and it's particularly egregious since the 2010 redistricting process. But we've also seen how in states where citizens are able, they are putting redistricting reform on the ballot, and it's winning. It won in Colorado, Michigan, and Missouri this cycle. It already exists in Arizona, California, and a few other places. And then I think in states where citizens are not able to put stuff on the ballot, legislators, particularly I think Democrats in this case, who've borne the brunt of gerrymandering this cycle, have to take really courageous stands, including potentially drawing maps that might draw them individual out of office, sort of for the greater good. They have to, acknowledge that this is a real evil in our democracy, and it's a real structural problem that we have to sort of be brave about and try to put an end to. There are, in this piece of legislation that Michelle mentioned that the Democrats are going to introduce, there is redistricting reform as part of that bill, and so there are things that the federal government can do when the federal government will do something about this. And the same is true on campaign finance reform. I mean, some people will say, and I think there's some validity in this, like the way to do it, to end Citizens United, is a constitutional amendment, and that, of course, is an incredibly uphill battle. But the good news is that the will is there on the part of the people. A vast majority, like 70, 80% of people support ending Citizens United, ending big money in politics, and so we just got to figure out how to make that happen.
So let me I might just refashion your question and take it up one notch, which is to say, think about this concept of corruption, right? If you have a particular theory of democracy, and the theory is that the majority should rule, then there are different mechanisms that you can use to corrupt democracy. One method is having money in politics, where people who have a lot of money have more say. Another method is districting in a way that gives more power to smaller numbers of people. Another method is vote suppression, right? And so these are all sort of different flavors of corrupting the democratic process. And I think that, you can talk about different ways to try to address them. The way our system is currently structured right now, we've got significant problems because you have to capture significant amounts of electoral power to be able to deal with problems that are corrupting the electoral process, right? So this is what's difficult about it, and that's why I have my one hat on that has my caveats, but another hat on that is more optimistic, because it's not just turnout. It's looking at this room. The youth turned out, and that was key, I think, for this election, was seeing, because this has been a big question, is whether the under sort of 30 set were going to vote, and they did. And I think in order to continue to kind of go in the direction where you can deal with these different kinds of corruption, we've got to get all generations involved, and particularly the folks in this room.
Let's close with your one-word answers of what justice means to you.
One word is difficult.
Okay, you can have a few. I know,
Yeah, I think a free and open and just society thrives when we come together and accept diversity of thought everywhere, on college campuses like this one, in every place, and we agree that we can disagree.
I have a hard time with this because I'll tell you why. The mood of the room is what we would define as justice, plain and simple, is probably pretty consensual in this room, and we believe that if we had true democracy, we would have true justice. That doesn't take into account, and we see this in the Trump voter and so on, a lot of people in this big diverse country define justice in very, very different ways. And you need to have a system that somehow can adjudicate very differing views of what justice is. I'm more comfortable with a view of justice that says everybody every voice is truly heard and the rule of law applies to everybody in their life and they're not subjected to violations of it. I can give my version of justice, but I know that where I come from, Louisiana, people would say, my view of justice is mass murder of unborn is going on, and that's the greatest injustice in America. That's what my cousins back home think. So I'm a little hesitant to say there's this very plain and simple view of what justice is that all Americans can agree on, and that's the big problem.
I largely agree with that. I won't say I'll pass,
Okay.
but the part that I particularly agree with is the idea that you have to have the Constitution, who was it, Holmes, who said the Constitution's built for people of fundamentally differing views, right? So you have to have the ability to be able to have clashes. What you don't want is the perversion of the ability to have clashes in a way that's going to design a foregone conclusion or a foregone result. So my idea of justice, I think, substantively might be different than a lot of other people who are outside of this room. But we've got to be able to have fair fights, and we don't have that right now.
I love that question. Thank you for asking it. I think it's so easy to get lost in all of this conversation about policy and also just our day-to-day lives. And if we don't stop to ask ourselves these kinds of questions from time to time and reflect on, we sort of lose sight of what really matters. So thank you. I'll say for me, it's justice is radical equality. And I think specifically that means policies and practices and engagement with each other that are equity-based. And that take into account the extreme inequality that we have, and that put pieces into place to move towards equality.
Thank you all very much. That was a fun conversation, and
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
So I have two quick assignments for you, and then I want to ask you to join me again in thanking the panel. The first is that everybody who has come today is going to receive in your email, probably tomorrow or so, a link to today's video. And we would appreciate your sharing it on whatever social media is your preferred mode of sharing. Second, to the extent you have views, more questions, more thoughts about the panel, or other ideas for Let's Talk conversations from University Life, please write to us at University Life. You have all our contact information up there. And third, actually, all students in the room every other week now are receiving a University Life newsletter, and that's the place to find out about all of those interesting events that you might not otherwise hear about, as well as other great things on campus. So you'll get it later today, open it up, remind your friends to take a look. Finally, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like I have learned a lot. I hope you all have. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.